Good afternoon, everybody. I think we ought to get started. We all know Kasani Aguaro as a bright and talented clinician who, as a PGY4 resident, will be graduating in just 3 weeks. But she also has a very impressive academic background with a number of notable accomplishments. Kasani was born in East Africa and came to the United States when she was 10 years old. And she entered college at San Diego State University with the intention of becoming a scientist. Kasani majored in interdisciplinary studies, combining chemistry, biology, and psychology. She graduated Phi Beta Kappa and won an award for Most Outstanding Student in a Major. She then won a prestigious McNair Scholarship, and with that scholarship did 2 years of basic science research in the field of immunology at the Scripps Institute, working on B-cell development. Becoming interested in HIV and AIDS, especially due to the devastating effect of this disease in Africa, she deferred her entrance to the medical scientist training program, including medical school, in order to do 2 years of research at the NIH National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease in the prestigious Laboratory of Immunoregulation headed by none other than Dr. Anthony Fauci. Yeah, wow, I was right. She again studied B cells, this time in the context of HIV and AIDS. And of note, there were 7 papers that she's co-author on as a result of this work. 7 papers. One thing she learned about HIV/AIDS is that the host response to the virus is a determining factor in the severity of the illness. She decided to enter the field of psychiatry after reading a case report about a woman with dissociative identity disorder who had some identities with diabetes and some without the disease. That remains a fascinating challenge to understand. She then completed medical school at the University of Alabama at Birmingham in 2008, where she won the award for Best Medical Student in Psychiatry. She then did an internship there. This is pretty astounding. She won the award for Best Psychiatry Resident as a PGY1. How we managed to recruit her here, I don't know. We haven't discussed that, but we were lucky enough to get her. And she came to the South Campus and has done the residency the past 3 years, now as chief resident. The mind-body interaction and psychosomatic medicine are particular interests of Kasani's. Over the past year, she's been involved in my lab designing a follow-up study to research I did 26 years ago in Yale undergraduates. Just last week, she won another award, receiving second prize in the highly contested GME poster competition for residents. And today we have the opportunity to hear a more detailed and expanded version of that research poster that was presented. I met Kasani when she was a PGY2 in a lecture that I gave on somatoform disorders. And Kasani stayed after class and asked some very intelligent and creative questions and indicated interest in doing research in the area. And so we agreed to work together, and she started working with me. And I was very, very impressed with how carefully and methodically she checked out all of the psychometric properties and background research of the instruments that we were going to be using. To add to that, she really, of her own initiative, decided to do an additional data collection in the University of Arizona undergraduates that has yielded some very interesting data that she'll present today. And interestingly, added her own measures because she didn't totally agree with everything that I said, which I thought was very commendable. Since then, we've been analyzing the data, and this is very intriguing that these data are really challenging existing models. So it's challenging existing knowledge and expanding the boundaries of what's known. So as a scientist, to me, it doesn't get better. And as a mentor, it's been very thrilling to see her grow and develop. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Kasani Aguaro.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much, Dr. Julian. You made me very happy with that glowing introduction, so thank you. So what is an emotion? I'll start there with some definitions. Everybody knows an emotion when we see one, but I'd like to start with basically getting us on the same page of what is an emotion and a feeling. I found a really good description in Antonio Damasio's book, The Feeling of What Happens, the subtitle being Body and Emotion in the Making of Consciousness. So he describes an emotion as a preset neural system that sends commands through the brain and the body via either the bloodstream or electrochemical signaling in the brain, the result being a global change in the state of the organism. Feeling is imaging these changes as they occur, or a collection, this collection of responses that's due to the emotion. And you get to knowing only when there's an application of core consciousness to the entire set of phenomena. So knowing an emotion, feeling a feeling only occurs at that point. So Antonio Damasio said primary emotions are always the result of body states, but he was not the first to have this idea. Back in 1884, William James said, emotions are no more and no less than the readout of internal body states. And Sigmund Freud said the ego is first a body ego. Sigmund Freud talked about psychosomatic illness in suggesting that some somatic afflictions may be caused by specific unconscious psychological conflicts that are defensively transformed into symbolically significant somatic symptoms. As we understand them, psychosomatic disorders are disorders in which there is significant interaction between somatic and psychological components with varying degrees of weighting of each component. So emotions are highly involved in these. There's a mind-body connection where emotions are involved in certain diseases such as migraines, functional bowel syndromes like irritable bowel. You also see them in diseases with end organ damage like hypertension, hyperthyroidism, asthma, and chronic skin disorders. Franz Alexander in 1950, the founder of the Chicago Psychoanalytic Institute, took Freud's idea to another level in developing specificity theory. He wrote that for each disorder there is a typical conflict. The typical conflict situation arouses anxiety in a particular patient. The anxiety then leads to specific unconscious psychological reactions which involve characteristic psychological defenses. These specific emotional reactions have specific parasympathetic or sympathetic concomitants which affect specific visceral organs. This excessive autonomic discharge caused by the chronic tension of repressed conflicts leads to a disturbance of this physiologic function, which may eventually lead to organic changes in genetically predisposed persons. So he was very specific about this, that he thought, he focused on these 7 psychosomatic diseases and thought that each one had a specific unconscious conflict that was going on. So focusing on gastric ulcer, there are strong needs to be taken care of, to be nurtured, and to have body contact. There's a very strong oral dependency that when your coping mechanisms supposedly get overwhelmed by stress in life, then the oral dependency takes over, the gastric secretion happens, and if the stress continues, you continue to develop an ulcer in genetically susceptible people. So this was an idea that Nemia and Sifnios took in 1970 to see if it was true, basically. They looked at 20 patients with psychosomatic disorders to see if they had certain psychological characteristics, conflicts they were dealing with, and they did not find that. They instead found a certain way of thinking, a mentation, which they described as, number one, the patients manifested either a total unawareness of feelings or an almost complete incapacity to put into words what they were experiencing. The associations of the majority of these patients were characterized by a nearly total absence of fantasy or other material related to their inner private mental life of thoughts, attitudes, and feelings, and a recounting, often in almost infinite detail, of circumstances, events in their environment, including their own actions. Their thoughts were stimulus-bound rather than drive-directed, meaning that they did not find evidence for specificity theory. instead of having repression occurring, which is kind of a top-down thing, where the cortex is involved in suppressing the emotion, these patients weren't even aware of their emotion. So Sifnios, who was Greek, was the first to use the Greek word alexithymia, which literally means no words for feelings, in order to capture what he considered to be this core characteristic of patients suffering from psychosomatic diseases. Alexithymia is measured through various measures. He developed a personality scale. The Toronto Alexithymia scale by far is the most widely used scale to define alexithymic individuals. But this scale, along with the Berman-Vorst Alexithymia questionnaire, is a self-report scale. So basically asking, do you have difficulty describing your emotions, yes or no? I mean, that's a summary of a question. So given that alexithymia is marked by a deficit of self-reflection, and that self-report measures ask precisely for self-reflection, the validity is not guaranteed. In fact, there was a study done which looked at, first gave the patients the task 20 and defined them as alexithymic, and then interviewed them about their emotional relationships. And the patients who scored higher on this actually were more emotional, particularly negative emotions they talked about. So when you look at alexithymia and you try to see whether it's related to health or disease, and you use the task 20, you define maybe some people with alexithymia, but also normal people, and also people who are more emotional. So we need a new conceptualization. What Dr. Lane is doing in a soon-to-be published article is suggesting that we redefine this term as affective agnosia. So going back to Freud, who defined agnosia as a recognition failure, an inability to connect stimuli to mental representations in 1895, so it's not exactly new. But it is a more appropriate term for what's going on. Those of us in Dr. Lane's class who've learned about some of the neurologic correlates to emotion have learned that there's connection between the limbic system and the frontal lobe and the cortex, and that this connection can help you to regulate your emotions and to make you aware of your emotions. What Dr. Lane is suggesting is that affective agnosia is actually a bottom-up problem, that the emotions, you're not communicating, you're not able to be aware of your emotions. There's a problem in the cortex. It's not repression, basically. So Dr. Lane developed this levels of emotional awareness scale in order to identify these individuals. The LEAS is a questionnaire that attempts to assess emotional awareness. The LEAS provides a participant with a situation, 20 vignettes, that includes another person. Each of the 20 questions asks, how would you feel? How would the other person feel? And it's an open answer question. Originally paper and pencil, it's now been developed into a computer scoring and administered test. And scoring is based on the cognitive developmental model that he originally described in 1987 with Gary Schwartz. So a participant may be awarded with the 20 vignettes, each maximum is 5 points, so up to 100 points. So based on these levels of emotional awareness, the first level is bodily sensations. And in this level, when you score the LEAS, you want to make sure you're scoring only the words that the person writes and not like interpreting their emotion for them. So in this level, you look for words that describe bodily sensations like sick to my stomach, nauseous, thirsty, dizzy. In level 2, action tendencies. So these describe like what you would do with the emotion. I would cry, I would laugh, I would smile. feeling needy, feeling a sense of helplessness, a sense of urgency, those things that make you want to do something. Level 3 is where you're able to describe a unidimensional emotional experience. So are you happy, sad, envious, enraged, compassionate, love, hate, things like that. And level 4 is when you can use these words that describe emotion and use more than one of them. So describe yourself as having more than one different emotion over a situation. And so these distinctively different emotions result in different facial expressions, for example. If you're able to do this for both yourself and the other person in the vignette, that's when you receive a level 5. So this LEAS has been looked at in the literature. These are the things it's correlated with that help to show that it is a measure of what we used to call alexithymia. It's a measure of affective agnosia. It's correlated with emotional intelligence tests, with the range and differentiation of emotional experience scale, accuracy of facial emotion recognition, self-reported empathy, impulse control, and cognitive developmental measures, as this is a theory that describes awareness of emotion in a cognitive developmental way. Other things that have been correlated with in the literature is each of these is a different study where patients with borderline personality disorder were found to have lower LEAS scores than their age-matched controls. Patients with IBS who have greater pain were less aware of their emotions than those with less pain. Also, you can learn emotional awareness. You can get better at it. So psychiatric inpatients with somatoform disorders seem to have lower levels of emotional awareness, which is what you would expect, which this was originally defined as a construct in patients with who somaticized, compared to psychiatric inpatients with anxiety or depression. Those same patients with somatoform disorders, after 3 months of intensive inpatient treatment, focusing on teaching them about their emotions, they get better results on the LEAS. Patients with eating disorders and with PTSD have lower levels of emotional awareness. And patients with essential hypertension compared to patients who have hypertension due to medical conditions have lower levels of emotional awareness, which kind of says that these are the patients that have the psychosomatic disorders. So there is a double-edged sword to emotional awareness, though. If you're obese and you have higher levels of emotional awareness, you're more likely to be socially anxious, probably because you know what people are thinking of you, you know what they feel about you, and that makes you uncomfortable. Individuals with generalized anxiety disorder have greater levels of emotional awareness. So maybe emotions or being aware of your emotions can make you more anxious. So our hypothesis was that alexithymia, or affective agnosia as measured by the LEAS, is correlated with physical health. And you would expect this to be true because this term was originally defined in patients with psychosomatic disorders, but it has not been proven in the literature. So this was a pilot study prior to conducting a follow-up study on the undergraduate Yale students that Dr. Lane developed this scale in. So I looked to undergraduate University of Arizona students and collected demographic information that included their age, marital status, income, languages spoken, including whether they were native English speakers, their socioeconomic status, their education and occupation. So we were able to analyze 68 undergraduates. 22 of them were male, 46 female. They were currently taking an undergraduate psychology course and received extra credit for coming. And their range of ages was 18 to 28, with most participants being 18 or 19. They were mostly working class. They were mostly Caucasian. None of these things seem to have an effect on LEAS. Well, a few. I'll describe it. So 90 students were originally invited. 74 showed up. 6 of them were excluded due to missing data. The data was analyzed using SAS and SPSS software, and the program for open-ended scoring was used to score the LEAS. And my student, Matthew Groisman, in the audience, and I separated, so he was involved in scoring the LEAS, and I was involved in scoring the other questionnaires, so it was kind of blinded. The questionnaires that I included emotional, spiritual, and personality factors, the positive and negative affect scale, which helps to see what sort of emotions they're feeling right now as they're taking the test. I also used the differential emotion scale, the Berkeley expressivity scale, how well they express their emotions, positive and negative, and how strongly they feel their emotions. The spirituality transcendence index, so looking at spirituality. The 5-facet mindfulness questionnaire that looks at mindfulness. The type D personality inventory that looks at the type D personality. And the brief symptom inventory that is a subset of the SCL-90, which evaluates the broad range of psychological problems and symptoms of psychopathology. It's been used extensively in the literature. However, it's 90 questions, so I found a briefer version of 10 questions, and the social adjustment scale. So to evaluate physical health, I looked at a questionnaire from the Washington State Health Insurance Program, and this is a questionnaire that people in Washington State fill out in order to determine whether they can be refused for health care or not. So it lists all medical diagnoses like separated in different disease categories, and they get certain points based on how severe the medical illnesses are and when they had it, whether it's in the past year or past 5 years or before that. The RAND SF-36, which is a set of quality of life measures widely utilized for assessment of care outcomes in adult patients. So this is more of a functional health survey that says like how well can you do your ADLs and like perform in what you want to perform based on physical or emotional limitations. And the somatization score of the SCL-90, I included that. Iris Bell at our university developed the Arizona Integrative Outcome Scale, which is a one-item scale where on the questionnaire you move your slider up or down based on your global sense of well-being. So taking into consideration everything you think is important in health subjectively. How healthy are you? So this is able to distinguish a relatively sicker from a relatively healthier individual. So looking at my results, using all the 68 people that I could analyze, I found that the LEAS is significantly correlated to a total sum of health with a correlation of negative 0.244. That's a moderate correlation, meaning that the higher that you score on the LEAS, the more medical illnesses you have, the more severe, the higher you score, the less medical illnesses you have, the less severe they are. So the severe med and the musculoskeletal and skin conditions are part of that questionnaire. And there are some correlations. This one is not significant, that severe people with lower scores in the LEAS are more likely to have severe medical conditions, and it's significant correlation between musculoskeletal and skin conditions. The Iris Bell scale, the Arizona Integrative Outcome Scale, was not related. So in thinking about my research, I got to think about whether the test is kind of biased. It's biased towards people who speak the English language. I mean, how can we ask you to describe your emotions in a language other than your own? Also, females seem to score higher, seem to be more emotionally aware. This was not significant, that the difference between females and males. There was a trend in my study, but it did not reach significance, and I did not want to exclude 22 people. So I did further analysis to see if gender modified the effect of LEAS on the sum of health, and it did not. If you control for gender using linear regression, you still have a significant correlation with the sum of health. Those who did not speak English, there were 8 of them, as a native language, did score significantly lower, and this was significant on the LEAS. In my further analysis of linear regression, I did find that if in this first model, if you control for not speaking English and look at LEAS, it's still correlated, but it drops out of significance at p-level of 0.055. However, and I was helped by Dr. Brightboard to do this analysis. He's published a paper on looking at moderators and mediators and how to analyze for moderating variables. So this is a moderating variable because if you create this intersection of LEAS with whether you speak English as a native language, that seems related to health. And with that variable, LEAS is not related to the total sum of health. So what that means to me is that the English language moderates the effect of how well you score and how that is related to health. And in talking with Dr. Lane, speaking, the LEAS is a better measure of affective agnosia if you restrict it to people who speak English based on how our brain works when we acquire a new language.
Or if you test them in their native language, whatever that
right, if you translate it. So I excluded those 8. I did not see a correlation with the total sum of health, however, or with Iris-Bell's scale. However, the severe medical problems became significantly correlated with low LEAS. So the lower you score on LEAS, the more likely you are to have severe medical problems. So these involve things like ulcerative colitis. Nobody had AIDS or cancer in my group, but severe medical problems, musculoskeletal and skin conditions also was significantly related. And I saw a lot of the people with musculoskeletal and skin conditions had the skin conditions, which tempted me to get it back to specificity and see, like, so I took the people for specificity theory, ulcerative colitis, I added irritable bowel syndrome, things that we think of that have a psychological component. And I could see it was not significant. And we've already said that specificity theory is not true. It doesn't describe this interaction because this is not repression. So moving on, the other things that were significantly related to low scores of the LEAS or low emotional awareness, where these people were more likely to agree with these statements. They felt they could easily put their beliefs, opinions, and expectations into words. So, and this was significant when a moderate correlation there. So if you ask them if they can self-report how emotionally aware they are, I'm not sure if that would be valid to describe. They also agreed with the statement, I perceive my feeling and emotions without having to react to them, or I watch my feelings without getting lost in them. And all of these were significant whether or not you excluded the English speakers. When you excluded the people who did not speak English, it did become, the correlation stayed. So the interesting thing I see is that they are not reacting to their emotions. So going back to Freud's idea, he thought that when you have mental tension, it can be discharged somatically in 3 ways, that there can be muscular activity that leads to a change in where your body is in relation to the environment. If you're scared, you run away, things like that. You can laugh, cry, scream, or talk about it. Or you can have respiratory, cardiovascular, and other visceral system changes. So the end effects of the modes of discharge was what he said that we subjectively experience as feelings, affects, or emotions. And that affects and emotions can be repressed, and then they are no longer experienced as such, although the processes discharging them into specific somatic systems can still occur. So this is what we think happens, that there's a stimulus, an emotional stimulus, and then you start to respond. So you either are highly responsive and you stay there, or you respond and then you never come back down. In a normal person, hopefully you respond, and when the threat goes away, you come back to normal homeostasis. In a maladaptive response, you can slowly start to respond and just keep responding. And so that's what we think is happening in alexithymic individuals, that they are either high up there, and there's some evidence, but we don't really know because a lot of the data is done with the TAS-20 that shows that people with alexithymia are more autonomically stimulated. But Dr. Lane has some data coming, that's I think from Germany, on using the LEAS and autonomic stimulation, so we'll see. So I was wondering, if you're not aware of your emotions, you can't express them. If you don't express your emotions, maybe it's the expression of the emotion that matters. And we think that it's the actual awareness that matters, but maybe this is a mediating factor. I looked at the Berkeley Expressivity Scale, which gives you a total, and the people who scored higher on the LEAS are more likely to be expressive of their emotions, and this was significant. Negative expression, so the expression of negative emotions, they were not any more likely to express negative emotions. They were more likely to express positive emotions, and the strength of their emotions was not significant, how strongly they felt. So they were, people with high emotional awareness are more likely to express and respond to emotion, with a higher tendency to express positive emotions, not significantly different in negative emotions. I also didn't see they were different in negative affect or positive affect at the moment of taking the questionnaire. They were more likely to agree with these statements. When I feel positive emotions, people can see exactly what I'm feeling. I sometimes cry during sad movies. I laugh out loud if someone tells me a joke I think is funny. And when I'm happy, my feelings show. But there is a downfall again. People with high scores on the LEAS were more likely to have experienced, during the past 4 weeks, role limitations due to emotional problems. So I guess if you're not aware of your emotions, you can happily go along with life. So they were more likely to have cut down on the amount of time they spent at work or on other activities, accomplish less than they would like, and they didn't do their work or activities as carefully as usual. So they also answered that during the past week, they were more likely to be bothered or distressed by temper outbursts that they felt they could not control, feeling hopeless about the future, with difficulty making decisions. So another form of emotional expression, difficulty making decisions when you're emotional, it becomes difficult, and sometimes your heart and your mind go against each other. The brief symptom inventory scale, which is 10 items that's supposed to be a measure of psychological distress, has these 3 items that are very strongly correlated. So overall, if you score high on LEAS, you're more likely to have this form of psychological distress that's due to these things. I did test them for psychological disorders, and they were not more likely to be, diagnosed with any psychiatric illness. So going back to that, we think it might be transient. I mean, this question is transient, that during the past week. The other question was the past 4 weeks. So we think it might be a transient psychological distress that these people with emotional awareness are experiencing. So in summary, the LEAS score did not correlate with a global sense of well-being, how healthy you think you are. Their parents' education, their socioeconomic status, type D personality, life satisfaction, spirituality, negative and positive emotions, and expression of negative emotions. So our data is consistent with previous data that suggests that LEAS is independent of negative affect, which is important because the TAS-20, the predominant thing to say what alexithymia is, supposedly, is correlated with negative affect. So any health correlations made with that scale, I think, you can have health problems due to negative affect. That's been shown. We demonstrate that affective agnosia is associated with poor health status, including a higher severity of disease and more musculoskeletal and skin conditions. Higher emotional awareness, as measured by the LEAS, may be associated with transient psychological distress and role functioning limited by emotional factors, independent of negative affect and psychological illness. So there are limitations in this cross-sectional study. The most important limitation is it's a cross-sectional study. It's a moment in time in a college student's life, and you don't know what came first. Were they more emotionally aware before they got healthier, or were they healthier and then got emotionally aware? I did do some other analysis, and the people who scored higher on the LEAS were more likely to take vitamins. They were more, they were more likely to take less over-the-counter pain medicine. But they were, I say more likely, it wasn't significant, but you could tell the trend was there. For the females, the people who scored higher on LEAS were also more likely to be on birth control. There was a lot of females on birth control. And alcohol seemed, there was more alcohol drinking in the higher LEAS. But none of this was significant, so I'm just rambling. So the basic limitation is that this is a cross-sectional study. So in order to see the true relationship between affective agnosia and health, we have to do a longitudinal study, and we have that opportunity with the Yale undergraduates who took the LEAS 26 years ago. So it's a unique opportunity that we have to conduct a prospective predictive study to look at the effect of emotional awareness on medical outcomes. So our hypothesis is that people with low scores on the LEAS, so i.e. low levels of emotional awareness, will have developed over this 26 years more physical disease, since they may be more likely to experience their emotions somatically. So there are limitations. The maximum number is 94. That's the original number that Dr. Lane used. We have contact information on 85 of them and are waiting IRB approval to be able to contact them. Also, I want to do it all online, and there's some limitations to that. I think that the most important thing is to make it short, and so that's why I did this pilot study. And medical history will not be like through patient records. It'll be through them giving us their medical history. So it's retrospective and therefore subject to recall bias. So here are my references. Dr. Lane's original study, this one for computer scoring of the levels of emotional awareness scale. And we did use the computer scoring, but Carolyn Fort, who's the world's best hand scorer, according to Dr. Lane, scored some of them, and she correlated 0.96 with the computer scoring, which gives us confidence in the computer scoring. Dr. Brightboard's paper on mediator and moderators in research, and some other papers, including Nemia and Sifnios's original paper describing alexithymia. So I'd like to thank Dr. Lane and Matthew Groisman, who's an undergraduate student here in the audience, Carolyn Fort, and Nicholas Brightboard, Rachel Peterson for helping with IRB approval. Mara Goodman is a student in Lane's lab who helped find the Yale undergraduates, and Gary Schwartz. So the funding was through the user fees for LEAS as well as the psychiatry department. So my personal acknowledgments are to Janet Black and Helen Macy, my program director, Richard Van Rose, my former program director, Catherine Sanderlin, my mentor while I was here, all the faculty and colleagues here and at UAB, and my family and friends. Thank you. Questions?
Yeah, I have a question on your slide where you talk about the downfall, and I'm thinking what you're saying here is that the higher LEAS people are maybe, well, they're self-reporting more difficulty with managing their moods and their grumpiness, but I wonder if they might be just a little bit more aware of their grumpiness, whereas the lower LEAS people are equally grumpy and have outbursts but just don't know they're doing it.
Exactly. Exactly. Thank you. That's what I think. And there's some evidence to show that to show that people who think that they can't describe their emotions maybe are actually doing a good job, but they feel like they can't describe their emotions because it's not good enough. All right. Yeah.
I want to elaborate a little on where your finding fits into what was previously known before you did this study, because I know there's this theory about physical health, but
I would like to. I tried to find the answer to that, and it's frustrating because a lot of alexithymia research is done with the TAS-20. So I read a paper on correlations with health and alexithymia, and with the TAS-20, what they're able to see is that there is a higher autonomic baseline state. So there are higher heart rate, blood pressure, things like that, but we don't know. So there are some studies Dr. Lane and others have done with the LEAS, like to show like skin conductance that if you're higher emotional awareness, you do respond to an emotional stimulus quicker. Is that right?
You respond to emotional stimulus more robustly.
And differentiated. They seem to have more differentiated somatic experiences. So you don't leave level 1, but you have a more varied experience.
so I think what you're saying is that there hasn't been much research to actually look at these physical health problems like the musculoskeletal problems and the skin problems.
Right, yeah. That was done, well, Nemia and Sifnios did it and when they discovered alexithymia, but since then the field, I think, has been corrupted. So
this
we
is
need
a
new data.
contribution in that way.
Oh, thank you. I think so, yeah.
That's a very good answer. I would just elaborate by saying that there are hundreds and hundreds of studies published with the TAS-20, and people have attempted to look at alexithymia as measured by the TAS-20 as a predictor of future health, but nothing is reported on that, which indicates
they don't find it.
They don't find it. So you have to go back to the original observation by Sifnios and Amaya. Either their observation was wrong, or we're not measuring it correctly. It's kind of one or the other.
And this study suggests that if you measure with the LEAS, then Sifnios and Amaya were onto something.
And so, I mean, it's even showing up in undergraduates, and who knows what we find, with respect to study over long periods of time.
I think along the same lines, like, I feel like the study that you're planning to go into later, just because psychosomatic illnesses take a time, and so the emotional expression not having, taken place over a number of years or a couple of decades would show you greater symptomatology
Yeah.
and physical findings than, say, in an undergrad population.
Yeah.
Healthy.
Yeah, they were all mostly 18 and 19, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So are the therapeutic indications then that if you can, whatever therapeutic modalities are out there to help someone become more aware of their feelings, then it's going to promote better physical health?
Yeah, I think helping a patient to have a story and be able to talk about their emotional life can help discharge. I agree with, part of what Freud said about discharging somatic things, when you're angry and you beat a pillow, your anger gets worse. But if you can talk about it, I think it diffuses it. So I think developing a story is important. And a lot of patients, at least in my experience, and I wonder, I think in your experience, patients with difficulty describing their emotions tend to be boring and difficult to engage, and and so when you can help them talk about their emotions more, they draw more people to them. They have better relationships, I think. So.
What other methods of trying to be more emotionally aware would you suggest? If one were to try and help our patients become physically healthier as well.
Well, I was wondering, related to story, I was wondering about that. I've tried in a few of my sessions with patients telling them a story that has some metaphor or something, and with some of my patients that really helps them and resonates with them. But also, I was asking Dr. Lane this myself. I wonder if there's a way to use these vignettes to kind of go through a hypothetical experience and what you would feel and help the patient to describe what they would feel. So kind of cheat with them at the LEAS and help them describe their emotions at a higher level. So
like a group setting, just so that people can process these emotional states together, or something like DBT.
Yeah.
I don't know.
DBT does it, doesn't it? Lisa.
Hisari, what I think I'm hearing you say is that you're suggesting that it's possible to teach emotional literacy, and that could be a function of psychotherapy. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I think so. Barring some sort of frontal lobectomy or something. So I think the more you use those, these patients maybe I have a patient who got attention for her stomach problems when she was little, and now she can't say she's upset. She can only say her stomach hurts. And maybe if she gets attention for saying she's upset, and I help her to say she's upset, maybe she can leave the stomach behind. I don't know.
Sharing the session. Does anybody have any other questions? One comment that I want to make is that I was just extremely impressed with your talk, because I know that the stuff that I've written and stuff isn't always that easy to understand, and you've done a really excellent job of explaining it to people.
She's a translator.
That's right. And so congratulations on that. In terms of the therapeutic implications, I just want to mention that there's a study that's been done in Germany of, it's about 64 patients who were randomized to either psychodynamic psychotherapy, which was manualized, or CBT. And then, and these were patients with panic disorder. And then they were given the manualized treatments. And then they looked at panic symptoms at the end of the 3 to 6 month treatment. And what was very interesting was that greater emotional awareness at baseline predicted greater reduction in symptoms in both modalities, both psychodynamic and CBT, which is consistent with the idea that being emotionally aware is a useful characteristic to have at baseline in order for psychotherapy to work.
Well, and probably worth mentioning, Richard, what they did for the really more alexithymic people in Germany.
Yes, that's true.
Oh,
do you want to comment on that?
no.
Okay. Well, so in Germany, they have psychosomatic inpatient units where they actually hospitalize people for 3 months for these intractable physical complaints for which there isn't an adequate organic basis. And the reason why this is done in Germany is that the medical care and the unemployment all come from the same pot, right? So if you have people who are disabled due to these physical complaints and you can get them back to work through this definitive treatment, it's cost effective. That's what they've shown, okay? So what does the treatment involve? It is multiple modalities of individual and group psychotherapy, as well as body-based therapies, massage, art therapy, movement therapy, etc. So what the clinicians do is they meet in teams and they share their observations. And essentially their aim is to understand the bodily expression of emotion and what emotions may be getting close to reaching conscious awareness, and then the therapists involved in the individual and group therapies are picking up on hints of these emotions that are first picked up in the nonverbal therapies, all right? So it's a kind of this transition from implicit to explicit. That's what they think they're doing, and it's the multiple modalities together. So these are the most difficult patients, in a way, who are lacking awareness and have lacked it for a long time, and that seems to be what's necessary to get them to a greater level of awareness. Okay.